we're going to take a look at the really at the contract manufacturing aspect of the finished dose form marketplace, and look at some of the dimensions and where that's going. But I wanted to start by making the point that just the significance of the finished dosage form in terms of getting the drug to the patient. You know, so much of the discussion within the pharmaceutical industry is typically around intellectual property. So, you know, creating intellectual property, protecting intellectual property, valuing intellectual property. Companies and products and ideas are bought and sold based on the intellectual property. But the bottom line is, a physician will never say, take 2 units of intellectual property and call me in the morning. The intellectual property has to be made into a physical product that can be delivered to the patient. And that's really what the finished dose form is about. So it really is that, as I've said, the physical manifestation of the scientific understanding of the disease and the intellectual property that has been developed around curing or at least managing the disease. So when we talk about finished dosage form, it's really the part of the process that most impacts the patient. One thing that's often not appreciated, and again, in part because of the focus on intellectual property, but also on within the pharmaceutical industry, and certainly in the history of CPhI, the focus has been on the active ingredient. But really, the finished dosage form is typically, for much of the business, the most expensive part of the product to make. When in the case of a branded new molecular entity, often the API is most expensive, the active ingredient, and that's because typically it's early on in the life cycle of the product. The manufacturing process hasn't been fully fine-tuned and so forth. So the API cost is often the greater part of the cost. But once the product becomes generic, and typically you'll have 3, 4, 5, maybe even 10 manufacturers who can supply the generic API, the price of the active ingredient goes way down. And it's really the cost of converting that API into a finished dose is where the expense is. So for a generic, the finished dose form expense is actually the biggest part. And then when you get into an OTC product, again, often because the product, partly because the API is so inexpensive at that point, and also because there's so much effort put into differentiating the product by way of the dosage form, and whether it's an extended release or some simpler way of delivering the product. It could be something as simple as color or shape in order to differentiate the product. There's a lot more effort put into the into the dosage form itself, along with the packaging, because of course once you go into the pharmacy, you want to catch the consumer's attention. So it's the finished dosage form and the packaging that are really the most important parts of the overall cost of goods, and the API piece is really relatively small. So when we think about a finished drug product, we really do need to be thinking about the effort that's gone into make that finished dose form. CMOs contract manufacturers play a significant part in that whole supply chain in terms of making the API into a finished dosage form that can then be administered to the patient. In our analysis, if we just look at FDA approvals, and I know that's a little bit US-centric, but the FDA is much better at providing data than some of the other regulatory agencies. And also, most new molecular entities are approved by the FDA and by the EMA So you're really looking at the same universe of products. But over the last 10 years, about 45% of the products that have been approved as new, not as generics, but as branded products or patent-protected products, about 45% of those drugs have their finished dosage form made by a CMO. So, and that's something that I think is certainly not fully appreciated around the industry. It's certainly not fully appreciated in the regulatory agencies. We presented this data to some FDA representatives last year, and they were really surprised. They had no concept that CMOs played such an important part in the supply chain. So CMOs are really significant players in this market, and the CMO industry has really grown at a fairly robust clip, 6 to 7% a year over the last 5 or 6 years. And that's because more and more drug companies are entrusting the manufacture of that finished dosage form to CMOs. And what we see around the industry is, particularly for small molecule products, solid dose, but also injectable products, as the big pharma companies move their pipelines to incorporate more biologics and relatively fewer small molecules, they're actually outsourcing a greater percentage of the small molecule products, even as they build more facilities to manufacture their biologics products. So CMOs are really becoming much more integrated into the supply chain for products than has been the case in the past. It's also worth noting that when we look at the CMO industry more broadly and think about both the big API companies as well as the finished dose companies, really all but 2 of the 10 or 12 largest CMOs have a significant position in the dose manufacturing part of the business. So if we go down the list, Lonza is certainly well known. They're probably the biggest, or certainly one of the 3 biggest players in the CMO industry. They don't yet have a dose manufacturing capability, although they're putting in some small-scale clinical manufacturing capability this year. But Patheon and Catalent, both of which exceed $1.5 billion in terms of their contract manufacturing revenues, are primarily dosage form manufacturers. And then if we go down through the list of companies with revenues of $500 million or more, again, all but one of them have a significant presence in the finished dose area. So as the CMO industry grows and matures, we're seeing a lot more large companies created partly through organic growth and partly through mergers and acquisitions. It's really the finished dose side of the business that's driving that consolidation and maturity of the CMO industry. It's also been the case that with all the M&A activity that there has been in the CMO industry, again, a lot of that has involved CMOs, finished dose manufacturers. But as you can see, often the valuations that are paid for those companies are really quite high. So if you think about say typically, if you're looking at a private equity situation where, excuse me, a company might be valued at 8 to 10 times earnings before taxes and depreciation. So that's what EBITDA is about, and that's kind of a proxy for cash flow. You can see typically finished dose form CMOs are being valued at 10 to 15 times their EBITDA or their cash flow. And those are really very high multiples when you look more broadly at the kind of valuations that companies get. And so we've seen a lot of activity in this area in recent years, with Patheon being an active acquirer. Siegfried has really converted itself from primarily a API CMO to a a broad capability CMO with both dosage form and API. Same with AMRI, which has both. Really, most of the companies on this list now have both API capability and dose form capability, and that's been a major development in the industry, as well as the creation of these full service API companies or CMOs. But the point being that there has been such demand for CMOs in terms of investors and companies wanting to broaden their capabilities, and there really haven't been very many for sale. So what those companies that have been on offer have gone at very high multiples in recent years, and we'll see, I think, several fairly large deals in the next 3 to 6 months involving dosage form CMOs as the industry continues to consolidate. So as we move forward, we really see finished dosage form development and manufacturing as really of growing importance around the industry, and that reflects a lot of the dynamics that Alan was talking about in terms of the evolution and the competition within the pharmaceutical industry, the effort to differentiate products, but it also has a lot to do with the nature of the products that are being developed and some of the technical challenges that a lot of the new products have. So we'll just step through a couple of these. One is just the question of bioavailability, the idea that a drug, once it's administered, whether it's orally or through injection or topically, it ultimately has to work its way through the body. It gets absorbed into the bloodstream, delivered to the target, wherever that is, and that's been a real challenge with a lot of the new products that are being developed, because they are poorly soluble. In other words, they're not soluble in water very readily. And if a drug isn't soluble, in most cases, it has no bioavailability. So it can't get to the target. It can't have a therapeutic effect. And so we see technologies that are typically administered at the finished dose point to try to enhance the solubility of the product. So technologies like spray drying, hot melt extrusion, micronizing, which just grinds the active ingredient into very small particles. All of those have become increasingly important to improve the bioavailability of the product. We also have a lot of interest in taste masking. A lot of the products that don't taste very good, they're bitter, and if you're going to get the patient to take them, you have to enhance the flavor in some way, at least for those few seconds where they have it in their mouth and get it down. So taste masking becomes important, and then controlled release. And the idea there being, obviously, if you can improve patient compliance by giving them something that they only have to take once a day, or maybe once a month, once every 3 months. If you look at the products like Enbrel and Humira that have been developed for rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune diseases, you can see a progression where the Enbrel, which was the first major one to come out, would have to be they're self-injected, but they'd have to be self-injected every 2 weeks. When Humira came out, that was just a monthly injection, and I think Cimzia may only be an every 3-month injection. So the idea of having a controlled release, so the patient doesn't have to remember when to take the dose quite as often, and doesn't, if it's unpleasant, it doesn't have to go through the unpleasantry quite as much. It's critically important. So, so just from a technical standpoint, there's this interest in or finished dose plays a more important role. The evolution of self-administered therapies has become important. Again, as we've seen drugs that are developed to treat autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis or Crohn's disease, or drugs that are inhaled, and of course the diabetes products. All of those are typically, those are self-administered by the patient, or someone gives them in the house, from the household will give it to the patient. And so the ability to develop delivery devices, administration devices that can be easily handled by the patient becomes important. If you think of, for instance, someone who has rheumatoid arthritis, that person has to have a device that makes the drug easy to administer. If it's painful to hold or needs a lot of pressure to administer, that's not going to work very well for a patient with rheumatoid arthritis. So devices are developed that make it much easier to administer. People don't like to watch themselves give it an injection, so if you can put together a device, an auto-injector device where the patient doesn't need to see the needle, that often helps a great deal in terms of compliance. So what we've seen with the graph on the right here is that just in the last couple of years, as we've seen more biologics come to market, we've also seen an increase in the number of pre-filled devices, whether they're pre-filled syringes or auto-injectors, other kinds of devices that, again, don't require the patient or the practitioner to use a needle, withdraw the product with a syringe from a vial, and then administer it. It's already packaged in the syringe and is ready to go. Or we've seen the inhalation devices, and the pictures here were both of devices from Bestpac, which is an interesting company because it under its parent company, Consort Medical, actually has a sister company now that is a contract manufacturer, and they're moving to the ability to, in a sense, to offer a one-stop shop where you get the device and have it filled from the same company. And I'm not sure that's a big trend, but certainly it's a unique strategy in the industry. Product differentiation, as I mentioned, is critical, and is something that companies will pay for, particularly at the OTC level. So it could be something as simple as shape, color, size that differentiates one product from another. Extended release, the idea that if you can take a product once a day instead of having to take it 3 or 4 times a day. Certainly in the States, we see advertisements all the time for, say, a product like Aleve, which can just needs is an over-the-counter painkiller that is one dose will last 12 hours versus other product. They compare themselves with Tylenol, which is acetaminophen, or I guess that's paracetamol over here, whatever. That has to be taken every 4 hours, and so the idea that you can dose less frequently is a big selling point. And now increasingly orally dissolving products, which and the examples here from Catalent, their Zydis product, the point being that they're fast absorption, they don't have to be swallowed. So for both convenience purposes, obviously you don't need water, but also that there are parts of the population, like the elderly, that may have difficulty swallowing a tablet. The idea of a fast dissolve formulation is very attractive. So just some final thoughts then. The finished dose form, as I say, is a very significant but really underappreciated part of the supply chain and of the development process, but I think it's one that's becoming increasingly important. It's a much bigger part of the value-added proposition now, both in terms of enabling a lot of the new medications that are coming out that frankly couldn't be delivered or administered if it weren't for innovations in the manufacture of the dose form. But also increasingly we're going to see device makers joining CMOs as major players in the finished dose form area. Thank you.